The airport was a hive of activity, a sea of people rushing to and fro. Businessmen in tailored suits, families with young children, tourists lugging suitcases. It was the usual chaotic mix. But Daniel Hartman, seated in the VIP lounge, hardly noticed any of it. He glanced impatiently at his gold watch, the weight of it reminding him of his success. His private jet, his prized possession, was delayed by a minor technical issue. To a man like Daniel, time was money, and he didn't like wasting either. Leaning back in his chair, Daniel sighed and rubbed his temples. His thoughts were far from the bustling crowd around him. They were occupied with the merger he'd just closed, the deals that were waiting, the endless cycle of meetings and obligations. He had it all: money, status, power. Yet, somewhere deep inside, there was a void. But Daniel wasn't the type of man to dwell on regrets or emotions. Those were weaknesses he had long abandoned, along with the people he'd left behind. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his eye. In the crowd, just beyond the glass of the lounge, a woman passed by. Something about her was oddly familiar, tugging at the corners of his mind. Her walk, her posture, it was unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat as recognition hit him like a freight train. It was Linda, his ex-wife. The woman he had walked away from 10 years ago, without a second glance, leaving her to fend for herself in the small town they once called home. The same woman he had promised forever, only to break that promise in pursuit of wealth and success. And now, there she was, in the same airport, looking different. She was dressed simply but elegantly, carrying herself with a grace he hadn't remembered. But it wasn't just her presence that sent a jolt through his system. It was the young man walking beside her. A tall, athletic figure, probably in his early 20s, with sharp features and a confident stride. His dark hair was tousled, and his jawline was strong. Something about him was hauntingly familiar. Daniel's eyes widened as the realization crept in. The young man looked just like him. Like a mirror from his own past, from a time when he was younger, more carefree, before life became consumed by the relentless pursuit of success. Questions flooded his mind, faster than he could process them. Who was this young man? Her son? Her lover? The possibility of Linda moving on, of her finding happiness without him, gnawed at his insides. The idea that this boy, who looked so much like him, might be someone important in her life now, was too much for Daniel to bear. The noise around him faded, and for a moment, it was just him, Linda, and this mysterious young man. His pulse quickened, his chest tightening with emotions he hadn't felt in years. Jealousy, curiosity, regret. Was this how his story with Linda ended? Was she better off without him? Daniel wrestled with the urge to get up, to follow her, to demand answers. His rational mind screamed at him to stay seated, to avoid the confrontation. But something deeper, something primal, pulled him to his feet. His legs moved before his mind could stop them. And soon, he found himself walking towards the exit of the VIP lounge, his heart pounding in his chest. As he stepped into the throng of travelers, he kept his eyes fixed on Linda and the young man, who were now approaching the departure gate. He was close enough to see the way they spoke to each other, comfortable and intimate. Were they a couple? His stomach churned at the thought. Or was the young man? No, it couldn't be, could it? Suddenly, Linda turned her head, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. In an instant, her eyes locked onto his. Daniel froze. It was as if the world stopped moving. The people around them blurred into the background. The hum of the airport vanished, and it was just the two of them, staring at each other after all these years. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of surprise, disbelief, and something else he couldn't quite place. But there was no warmth, no recognition of the man she had once loved. Only cold, detached curiosity. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say after all this time? "I'm sorry" seemed too small, too inadequate for what he had done. "How have you been?" felt absurd, considering he had abandoned her without a word. The young man, sensing something in the air, turned to look at Daniel. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, Daniel was confronted with a younger version of himself. The resemblance was uncanny. The sharp cheekbones, the same piercing eyes, even the slight arch of the brow that Daniel recognized from old photographs of himself. It was unsettling. "Linda," Daniel finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. He took a step closer, his heart racing, unsure of what he was about to do or say next. Linda held his gaze, and for the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in her eyes, something that looked like pain, but she quickly masked it. The young man, oblivious to the storm brewing between them, glanced between the two. He tilted his head, confused but calm. "Do you know this man, Mom?" "Mom." The word hit Daniel like a sledgehammer. He staggered back slightly, his mind racing to make sense of what he just heard. The young man wasn't Linda's lover. He was her son. Their son. Daniel's head spun as the realization dawned on him. He hadn't just walked away from Linda all those years ago. He had walked away from his own child. He had abandoned not only his wife but his family. The young man standing before him was the son he never knew existed. And now, after all this time, here he was, face to face with the life he had chosen to ignore. His throat went dry, and words failed him once again. The weight of his past mistakes came crashing down, and he stood there, paralyzed by guilt, regret, and the painful truth of what he had lost. Linda, sensing his turmoil, gently touched her son's arm, as if to shield him from the man who had caused so much pain. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. As Daniel stood there, frozen in time, the memories of his last moments with Linda flooded his mind. The moment he had walked out of their home, the cold silence of his departure, the look of betrayal on her face as he left without a second thought. Now, 10 years later, he was face to face with the consequences of his actions, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Hartman wasn't sure how to fix it. 10 years ago, life for Daniel Hartman and Linda seemed like a picture-perfect dream. They lived in a quaint, peaceful town nestled between rolling hills and winding rivers, a place where the air smelled of fresh grass and neighbors knew each other by name. Their home was a cozy 2-story cottage with a white picket fence, the kind of place where a future was built on love, trust, and shared dreams. Back then, Daniel wasn't the millionaire mogul he would later become. He was ambitious, no doubt, but still tethered to the simpler joys of life. Mornings started with coffee at the kitchen table, where the sunlight streamed in through the window, and the scent of Linda's homemade pancakes filled the air. They'd sit together, discussing plans for the day, laughing about little things. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that seemed enough. Daniel had met Linda during his early days of struggling to start a business. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, and they were introduced through mutual friends. From the moment Daniel laid eyes on her, he was smitten by her warmth, her kindness, and the way she made everyone around her feel at ease. Linda wasn't just his wife. She was his confidant, his support system. Every time a deal fell through, every time the bank turned him down for another loan, she was there, encouraging him to keep pushing forward. The early years of their marriage were marked by late nights spent in his small office, hunched over plans for a new venture, while Linda brought him coffee and whispered reassurances that one day it would all pay off. And slowly it did. Daniel's persistence began to bear fruit. His construction company started landing bigger contracts, first with local businesses and then with developers in nearby cities. The money began to trickle in, and soon it flowed like a river. But with success came change. As Daniel's business grew, so did his ambition. He was no longer satisfied with just making ends meet. He wanted more contracts, more clients, more recognition. The small town that had once been enough for him began to feel claustrophobic. He started spending more time away from home, attending meetings in big cities, hobnobbing with wealthy investors, and mingling with people who lived lives of luxury. And slowly, as his world expanded, Linda's world seemed to shrink in his eyes. At first, Linda tried to keep up. She joined him at fancy events and wore the designer clothes he bought her, even though she still preferred her comfortable cardigans and jeans. She smiled politely through dinners with people whose conversations revolved around stocks and assets, when all she wanted was to talk about the children she taught at school. She sensed the growing distance between them, but she held on, believing that it was just a phase, that once the dust settled and the business stabilized, they'd find their way back to each other. But the more successful Daniel became, the more distant he grew. He began to view their small-town life as a limitation, a weight holding him back from reaching even greater heights. The cottage that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed too small, too insignificant. Linda, with her simple joys and quiet contentment, no longer fit into the image of the life Daniel envisioned for himself. As his company expanded, so did his sense of entitlement. Daniel began to believe that he deserved more than just a comfortable life. He deserved the world. He was now rubbing shoulders with CEOs, driving luxury cars, and staying in five-star hotels. He convinced himself that he was destined for greatness, and that greatness couldn't be achieved by staying tied to the past. And slowly his affection for Linda, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin, began to fade, replaced by a growing desire for something more glamorous, more exciting. The breaking point came one cold autumn evening. Daniel had just returned from a week-long business trip in the city, his suitcase still packed with tailored suits and expensive gifts for himself. Linda, as always, was waiting for him at home, her smile tentative, hoping that this time he would stay for more than just a fleeting moment. But that night was different. Daniel walked through the front door, the usual warmth of the house failing to reach him. Instead of embracing Linda, he stood in the doorway, looking around as if seeing their home for the first time. The walls, the furniture, the life they had built together, it all felt foreign to him, like a relic from a past he no longer belonged to. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold and distant. Linda's heart sank. She knew that tone too well. It was the same voice he had used over the past few months when discussing work, when canceling plans, when avoiding conversations about their future. But this time, there was no escaping what was coming. "I can't do this anymore," Daniel said, his eyes avoiding hers. "I've changed, and I think we want different things now." Linda's world shattered with those words. She stared at him, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he was saying. For years, she had supported him, stood by him, believed in him. And now, after everything, he was telling her that she was no longer enough. "What are you saying, Daniel?" Her voice trembled, though she already knew the answer. "I'm leaving," he said bluntly, his tone devoid of emotion. "I need more than this. More than us." The words cut through her like a knife. Linda felt her knees weaken, but she stood firm, refusing to let him see her break. She had always been the strong one, the one who held them together. But now, that strength was being tested in ways she never imagined. "You're just going to walk away," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "After everything we've been through." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He couldn't look at her, couldn't face the hurt in her eyes. But his decision was already made. In his mind, Linda was part of a life he had outgrown, a life he no longer wanted. "I've already made arrangements," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "I'll leave in the morning." Linda's heart broke. There was no argument, no plea that could change his mind. She knew it in the way he stood, the way he spoke. He had already checked out, emotionally and mentally. He had chosen his path, and it didn't include her. That night, Daniel packed his bags. He moved through their home like a stranger, gathering his things without a second glance at the memories they had shared. Linda watched from the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face, unable to stop him. In the morning, Daniel was gone. He left without a goodbye, without looking back. For weeks, Linda felt like she was drowning in the emptiness he had left behind. The house was quiet, too quiet. The bed was cold, the meals were smaller, and the silence was deafening. Friends and neighbors tried to console her, but their words did little to heal the gaping wound in her heart. She had lost more than just her husband. She had lost her sense of security, her future, her partner in life. She didn't know how to move forward. The pain was too deep, the betrayal too raw. But slowly, day by day, Linda began to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy. There were days when the grief was so overwhelming that it felt like she couldn't breathe. But she kept going, kept fighting to find herself again in a world without Daniel. Little did Daniel know, as he left town in search of his glamorous new life, that Linda would one day rise from the ashes of their broken marriage. And the next time he saw her, she wouldn't be the same woman he had left behind. The first few months after Daniel left were the hardest of Linda's life. The emptiness of the house seemed to echo her pain, every room a reminder of the life she thought she'd have, and the person who had walked out without looking back. Financially, she was barely scraping by. Daniel had taken most of their savings when he left, and while her job as a teacher kept a roof over her head, it wasn't enough to maintain the life they had built together. Emotionally, Linda was adrift. Each morning felt like a battle, as if just getting out of bed required a monumental effort. She would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where Daniel once sat, wondering how her life had unraveled so quickly. Friends tried to comfort her, telling her that it would get easier, that she was better off without him, but their words fell hollow. Daniel's departure had left a wound that seemed impossible to heal. But Linda wasn't the kind of woman who gave up easily. Beneath the heartbreak, there was a spark, a quiet strength that had been buried under years of compromise and self-sacrifice. Slowly, she realized that she had a choice to make. She could let Daniel's abandonment define her, or she could reclaim her life and rebuild from the ashes. The thought of staying broken, of being pitied by those around her, was intolerable. She needed to find a way forward, not just for herself, but for her own dignity. It started small. Linda began taking long walks through town, finding solace in the familiar sights and faces. The community had always been supportive, and in her darkest hours, the kindness of neighbors was a lifeline. People she barely knew dropped off food, offered to help with anything she needed, and sent notes of encouragement. Slowly, she found herself leaning on them, realizing that she wasn't as alone as she had felt. But kindness from others wasn't enough to heal her. Linda knew she needed something more. She needed purpose, something that was hers and hers alone, something that would give her a reason to wake up each day with hope instead of despair. That's when the idea came to her, a business of her own. The town had been lacking a proper bookstore, and Linda, who had always loved reading, decided to fill that void. It was a risky move, starting a business with barely any capital and no prior experience. But she had a vision, and for the first time in months, she felt a spark of excitement. Linda scraped together what little money she had, sold a few of her belongings, and took out a small loan from the local bank. Opening the bookstore wasn't easy. There were days when she doubted herself, when she worried that it was a foolish dream, doomed to fail. But Linda poured everything she had into the shop, working long hours, curating a selection of books that catered to the community's tastes, and hosting events to draw people in. Slowly, word spread, and the store became a beloved fixture in the town. It was during this time that she met Martin, the mysterious man who would become her mentor. Martin had recently moved to the town from the city, a retired entrepreneur with a background in business. He wandered into the bookstore one rainy afternoon, curious about the new shop, and struck up a conversation with Linda. There was something about him, an air of quiet wisdom and experience, that drew Linda in. Over time, they became friends, and Martin offered to help her with the business, teaching her everything he knew about running a successful venture. With Martin's guidance, the bookstore flourished. Linda's confidence grew, and for the first time since Daniel left, she felt truly independent. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. The community rallied around her, supporting her business and admiring the strength she had shown in the face of adversity. But it wasn't just the business that had changed Linda's life. There was another, much more personal development, one that she had kept hidden from most of the town, and especially from Daniel. The young man who had accompanied her to the airport, Alex, was introduced to the audience, though his true connection to Linda was not immediately clear. Alex, in his early 20s, had the same dark hair and sharp features that Daniel once had in his youth. He walked with confidence, a quiet strength in his demeanor that hinted at a life shaped by challenges. At first glance, Alex seemed like any other young man, but there was something about him, something that made Daniel uneasy as he watched from a distance. As Linda stood with Alex, waiting for their flight, Daniel found himself unable to tear his eyes away from them. The shock of seeing Linda again had already hit him like a punch to the gut, but seeing her with Alex stirred something deeper, something more unsettling. Who was this young man? Was he her lover, or perhaps her son? The resemblance to Daniel was too striking to be ignored. From his vantage point across the terminal, Daniel's mind raced. He had left Linda behind, assuming she would fade into his past, like so many other things he had abandoned in his pursuit of wealth and success. But the woman standing before him now was not the woman he had left. She was stronger, more self-assured, and there was a quiet dignity about her that made Daniel question everything he had once thought about her. And then there was Alex. As Daniel studied him, a gnawing suspicion began to form. Could this young man be connected to his past in ways he hadn't anticipated? The idea seemed absurd at first, but the more Daniel watched, the more he saw his own reflection in Alex. The same mannerisms, the same intensity in his gaze. Tension crackled in the air as Daniel debated whether to approach them. He felt a mixture of emotions: regret, curiosity, jealousy, and something else he couldn't quite identify. He had moved on from Linda, or so he had thought. But seeing her now, successful, and happy without him, stirred feelings he hadn't anticipated. Was it possible that he had underestimated her all those years ago? Had he been so blinded by his ambition that he had failed to see the woman she truly was? As Daniel took a step closer, intending to confront them, something stopped him. Alex turned his head, as if sensing Daniel's presence. Their eyes met, and for a moment, it was as if time stood still. There was recognition in Alex's gaze, a knowing look that sent a chill down Daniel's spine. And then Alex spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Daniel Hartman," he said, addressing him by name. Daniel froze, caught off guard. How did this young man know his name? The tension in the air thickened as Linda turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She stood beside Alex, her eyes locked on Daniel's, but she said nothing. The realization hit Daniel like a tidal wave. This wasn't just some random young man. This was something much more personal, much more profound. And in that moment, Daniel knew that his past was about to collide with his present in ways he hadn't prepared for. But the full story of Alex's identity, and the reason he was here with Linda, was yet to be revealed. As the tension built, the unanswered questions loomed large. Who was Alex, really? And what had happened in Linda's life during the decade Daniel had been absent that had led to this moment? The story was far from over. Daniel stood frozen in the middle of the airport, his heart pounding in his chest as Alex's voice echoed in his ears. "Daniel Hartman," Alex had said, addressing him with a calm certainty that sent a chill down his spine. How did this young man know him? Who was he, really? Daniel's eyes darted from Alex to Linda, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. Linda's face was unreadable, her eyes betraying no emotion, yet he could sense the weight of the moment. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something bigger, something that had been waiting to come to light for years. Summoning his courage, Daniel stepped closer, his voice cracking with barely contained frustration. "Linda, who is this? Who is he?" His eyes flicked to Alex, suspicion clouding his thoughts. Is this your boyfriend? What is going on?" The question hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Daniel's mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. The young man standing beside Linda bore an eerie resemblance to him, almost like looking into a mirror of his younger self. But the idea that this could be her new lover, someone who looked so much like him, seemed too strange, too impossible. Alex stood silently, watching Daniel with a measured gaze, his expression revealing nothing. It was Linda who broke the tense silence, her voice low but firm, steady as the storm of emotions swirled around them. "No, Daniel, he's not my boyfriend," she said, her tone sharp, as though cutting through the tangled web of assumptions. She took a step forward, placing herself slightly between Daniel and Alex, as if protecting her son from the oncoming blow. "This is Alex, and he's your son." The words hit Daniel like a hammer to the chest. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Everything around him, the bustling airport, the sounds of travelers rushing past, the announcements over the loudspeaker, faded into a dull hum. His mind could barely process the revelation. His son. The young man standing before him, the one who looked so much like him, wasn't Linda's new lover. He wasn't some stranger. He was his son. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, his mouth dry as he struggled to find words. "My son," he whispered, as if saying it aloud might make it real. His gaze snapped to Alex, who stood still, watching his father with an unreadable expression. How is this possible? "Linda, why didn't you?" Linda cut him off, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "Why didn't I tell you?" she said, her voice trembling with the weight of 10 years' worth of unspoken words. "Because you left, Daniel. You walked out on us. You didn't want this life. You didn't want me. You didn't want a family." Her words were like daggers, each one piercing the carefully constructed armor Daniel had built around his heart over the past decade. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend himself, but the truth of it hit him hard. He had left. He had chosen wealth, power, and ambition over everything else, over the woman he had once loved, over the life they had built together. And now, standing here in front of him, was the consequence of that choice. His son, a stranger he had never known existed. "I didn't know." Daniel's voice cracked, his eyes wide with disbelief. "I didn't know, Linda. Why didn't you tell me? I had a right to know, didn't I?" Linda's face softened, but only slightly. The pain in her eyes was still raw, still palpable. "A right," she repeated, almost incredulously. "Daniel, you left without a word. You made it clear that this life wasn't what you wanted. I found out I was pregnant after you were already gone. And by then, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to beg you to come back. I wasn't going to force you into something you never wanted." Daniel's hands shook as he tried to process what she was saying. He turned to Alex, who had remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold. "You're my son," Daniel repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you? Why didn't you ever reach out? Why didn't you come find me?" Alex's expression hardened, his voice laced with a quiet anger that Daniel hadn't expected. "Why?" Alex said, his eyes narrowing. "Because I didn't need you. Mom didn't need you. You walked away from us before I was even born. And by the time I knew who you were, I didn't want anything to do with you." The words cut deep, sharper than anything Linda had said. Daniel's heart ached as the full weight of his choices bore down on him. The son he had never known existed was standing in front of him, filled with resentment and bitterness. He had missed everything. Alex's birth, his childhood, his milestones. He had missed it all. And now, it was too late to go back. I didn't know," Daniel stammered, his voice breaking with emotion. "I would have." "What?" Alex interrupted, his voice rising. "You would have come back. You would have been a father to me." "I doubt it. You were too busy chasing your fortune. I grew up fine without you. And I'm not here for some big reunion." Daniel felt his chest tighten, guilt and regret swirling inside him like a storm. He had never imagined himself as a father. He had never even considered the possibility that Linda could have been pregnant when he left. But now, faced with the reality of it, he was overwhelmed with emotion. He had abandoned his wife and his son, not just physically, but emotionally too. And now he was paying the price. Linda stepped forward, her voice softening as she spoke. "Daniel, I made a decision when I found out I was pregnant. I decided that Alex would have a better life without the pressure of your world. You had already chosen to leave, and I knew that if you came back, it wouldn't be because you wanted to. It would be out of obligation. I didn't want that for Alex. I didn't want him to grow up in your shadow." Daniel's mind reeled. He felt like he was drowning, gasping for air, trying to find some way to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be made. He had lost more than he ever realized. He had lost a family, a life. And now, it was too late to go back. I don't know what to say," Daniel whispered, his voice hollow. "There's nothing to say," Alex replied, his voice cold. "You made your choice 10 years ago, and we made ours. We don't need you." The words hung in the air, final and unyielding. Daniel's heart shattered, the weight of his past choices crashing down on him. He had spent a decade chasing after wealth and success, believing that those were the things that mattered most. But now, standing here, face to face with the son he never knew he had, and the woman whose heart he had broken, he realized just how wrong he had been. Linda reached out and touched Alex's arm gently, signaling that it was time to go. She glanced at Daniel one last time, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "Goodbye, Daniel," she said softly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." And with that, she turned and walked away, her son by her side. Daniel stood alone in the bustling airport, the noise and chaos around him feeling distant, as if he were watching it from behind a pane of glass. He felt hollow, like everything he had built, everything he had achieved, meant nothing. He had lost his family, and now, standing there, watching them walk away, he realized that the wealth, the success, the life he had chased for so long, none of it could fill the void left behind by the people he had abandoned. He had made his choice 10 years ago, and now he was living with the consequences. The airport confrontation between Daniel, Linda, and Alex had left Daniel in a daze. After the emotionally charged encounter, he walked back to his car, numb and overwhelmed. As he drove away, the realization that he had a son, and that he had lost any chance of being part of his life, hit him hard. The weight of his past choices bore down on him like never before, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Hartman felt truly lost. In the days that followed, the news of the airport encounter spread like wildfire through their small town. Gossip, once the quiet undercurrent of the community, now surged with fervor. People who had once admired Daniel for his rise from humble beginnings to millionaire status began to see him in a different light. It wasn't long before the story took on a life of its own. Whispers echoed in the local cafe, at the grocery store, and even among his former business associates. "Did you hear about Daniel Hartman?" they would say, shaking their heads. "Turns out he abandoned his wife and son years ago. And now look at him. All that success, but at what cost?" The town, once in awe of Daniel's success, now viewed him as a cautionary tale. People no longer saw him as the charismatic self-made millionaire who had escaped the limitations of their small town. Instead, they saw him as a man who had sacrificed everything that truly mattered for money and power. His glossy image was tarnished, and the isolation he had once chosen now became a cage of his own making. Meanwhile, Linda's story became something of a legend in the town. While Daniel's reputation crumbled, Linda was seen as the embodiment of resilience and strength. People marveled at how she had rebuilt her life, running her own business, and raising a son on her own. They spoke of her with admiration and respect, and she became a figure of quiet dignity in the community, someone who had not only survived betrayal, but had thrived in its aftermath. Linda's bookstore, once a small and modest endeavor, became a hub of the community. More people started coming in, not just to buy books, but to support her, to share stories of their own struggles, and to draw inspiration from her perseverance. Linda, always humble, never sought the attention, but it found her nonetheless. The same neighbors who had once felt sorry for her after Daniel left now saw her as a symbol of what it meant to rise above adversity. Her relationship with Alex had grown stronger over the years, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared hardships. Alex had grown into a man who admired his mother for her strength and independence, even as he harbored a quiet anger toward the father he had never known. Linda had been transparent with him from the start, never vilifying Daniel but never sugarcoating the truth either. She had always been honest about why Daniel left, and Alex had grown up understanding that sometimes people make choices for selfish reasons. He had accepted that his father had chosen a different life, but deep down, a part of him had always wondered why he hadn't been worth staying for. For Daniel, the fallout was not just public, it was deeply personal. He couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at him, a constant reminder of the family he had left behind. His once busy schedule, filled with high-profile meetings and business deals, suddenly felt hollow. The luxurious penthouse he returned to every night felt cold, empty, and suffocating. The things that had once given him pride, his wealth, his status, his accomplishments, no longer brought him any sense of fulfillment. Instead, they were a painful reminder of what he had traded for them. He became haunted by thoughts of Linda and Alex. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces. Linda, who had stood strong in the face of his abandonment, and Alex, the son he had never known. Regret consumed him. He couldn't help but replay the decisions he had made over the years, wondering how different his life might have been if he had stayed, if he had chosen love over ambition. His business, once thriving, began to suffer as Daniel's focus wavered. He missed meetings, delayed decisions, and lost his edge in the corporate world. His once sharp instincts dulled by the emotional turmoil that now defined his days. His colleagues noticed the change, and soon rumors began circulating about his mental state. Investors grew uneasy, sensing that the man who had once been unstoppable was now crumbling under the weight of his own success. As Daniel spiraled deeper into guilt and regret, Linda's life continued to move forward. She faced challenges, of course. Running a business and being a single parent wasn't easy, but she had built a life of purpose and stability, and she drew strength from the love of her son and the support of the community. Alex, now in his 20s, had become a pillar of support for her. He helped out at the bookstore when he wasn't working and had become an integral part of Linda's world. But despite the strong bond between them, Alex harbored unresolved feelings about his father. His resentment toward Daniel had festered for years, a quiet anger that had never truly been confronted. However, as much as Alex resented Daniel for abandoning him, there was another, more complicated layer to his feelings. Beneath the anger, there was a yearning for understanding. Alex had grown up hearing about his father's success, about how Daniel had left to pursue a life of wealth and ambition. He had always wondered what it was that drove his father to leave them behind, and whether there was something in him that Daniel had rejected. A part of Alex longed for his father's acknowledgement, even if it was too late for a relationship. This inner conflict came to a head when Alex and Linda ran into Daniel again, weeks after the airport confrontation. It was an unexpected encounter. Daniel, disheveled and looking more broken than Alex had ever seen him, had come to the bookstore, clearly wrestling with his own demons. There was no bravado, no air of confidence, just a man weighed down by guilt and regret. Alex had felt his anger flare up as soon as he saw Daniel. The father who had abandoned him now stood before him, looking for redemption, or maybe just closure. But before Alex could lash out, something surprising happened. Daniel didn't offer excuses or explanations. He didn't try to justify his choices. Instead, he looked at Alex with raw, unfiltered emotion and said, "I'm sorry. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm sorry." The words took the wind out of Alex's sails. He had expected defiance, or maybe indifference. But this was something else entirely. For the first time, Alex saw his father not as the larger-than-life figure he had built up in his mind, but as a flawed, broken man who had made terrible choices and was now grappling with the consequences. It didn't erase the years of pain, but it changed something inside Alex. It cracked open the wall he had built to keep his father out. As Daniel stood there, vulnerable and exposed, Alex was faced with a decision. He could continue to hate the man who had left him, or he could begin to understand him. The choice wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate. But as he looked into his father's eyes, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was room for something more. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to reach out to Alex again. At first, Alex resisted. The wounds were still fresh, and the resentment hadn't disappeared. But slowly, cautiously, Alex began to let his father in. There were no grand gestures, no immediate resolutions, just quiet conversations, tentative steps towards something resembling understanding. For Daniel, it was a glimmer of hope in the dark. He knew he could never undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could find a way forward. The days following Daniel's quiet apology in the bookstore marked the beginning of a long and painful journey toward redemption. It wasn't a linear path. There were no instant miracles, no grand reconciliations, but there was a subtle shift in the way Daniel approached his life. For the first time in years, he began to realize that the wealth, success, and power he had spent his life chasing had come at an immeasurable cost. It had robbed him of the one thing that truly mattered: family. Daniel's transformation didn't happen overnight. He wasn't the kind of man to easily open up, and old habits of pride and self-reliance were hard to break. But the encounter with Linda and Alex had left him raw and vulnerable, forcing him to confront the emptiness of his accomplishments. He began to understand that all the wealth in the world meant nothing if you had no one to share it with, no one to care about beyond yourself. He started small, reaching out to Alex cautiously, carefully. Daniel had learned enough not to push too hard, but he showed up in the little ways that mattered, sending Alex a text now and then, checking in on how he was doing, offering to meet up for coffee or a casual lunch. At first, Alex remained distant. His wounds were deep, and he had spent years building a life without his father. He wasn't ready to forgive. Not yet. For Linda, the process was even more complicated. She had spent a decade rebuilding herself from the ground up, learning how to live independently, to stand tall after the devastation of Daniel's betrayal. While she didn't hold on to bitterness, forgiveness didn't come easily either. After all, she had spent years raising Alex alone, without the support of a husband. And although she had thrived on her own, there was a part of her that wondered what life might have been like if Daniel hadn't left, if he had chosen them over his ambitions. Linda's friends often remarked on her strength, how she had weathered the storm of abandonment and come out stronger on the other side. But when Daniel quietly re-entered their lives, Linda found herself grappling with emotions she thought she had buried long ago. Could she forgive him? Should she forgive him? And what would that forgiveness even look like? The community, too, watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Many of them had lived through the fallout of Daniel's departure, and they had seen firsthand how Linda had endured the struggle of raising Alex alone. To see Daniel now, humbled and seeking redemption, was a twist in the story that few had expected. Some in the town wanted to see him suffer for what he had done. Others, more charitable, believed in second chances and hoped he could find a way to make amends. As the months passed, Alex and Daniel's tentative relationship grew into something more substantial. Alex, while still cautious, began to see that his father was genuinely trying. Daniel wasn't asking for instant forgiveness, nor was he trying to step into the role of dad after missing out on so many years. He was simply showing up, being present in Alex's life in a way he had never been before. But the question of forgiveness still loomed large. Could Alex truly forgive the man who had abandoned him before he was even born? Could he let go of the resentment that had defined so much of his identity? These were questions that haunted Alex, even as he allowed his father back into his life. He didn't know if he could ever fully trust Daniel, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Linda, too, struggled with the moral dilemma. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way she had been when Daniel first left. But forgiveness was a different kind of challenge. She had spent years learning to live without him, and now that he was back, she wasn't sure what role, if any, he should play in her life. The strength she had cultivated was hard-won, and she didn't want to lose herself in the process of reconciling with the past. One evening, after months of slowly rebuilding a fragile connection, Daniel, Linda, and Alex sat down together for dinner at a quiet cafe in town. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. It was the first time they had all been together since the airport confrontation, and there was an unspoken understanding that this dinner could be a turning point. As they talked, the conversation flowed naturally at first, about Alex's work, the bookstore's success, and general life updates. But as the evening wore on, the conversation turned serious. Daniel, his voice quieter than usual, finally addressed the elephant in the room. "I know I can't change what I did," he began, looking first at Linda and then at Alex. "I know I missed out on your lives, and that's something I'll regret for the rest of my days. But I'm here now. I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it, but I'm trying to be better. And I hope, one day, you'll see that." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Linda, her hands resting in her lap, looked at Daniel with a mixture of sadness and understanding. She spoke first. "Daniel, it's not about deserving forgiveness," she said softly. "It's about whether or not we can move forward. I don't know if I can fully forgive you, not yet, but I see that you're trying, and that means something." Alex, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. His face was conflicted, torn between the anger he had held onto for so long and the desire to finally let it go. After a long pause, he spoke. "I've spent my whole life wondering what it would have been like if you'd stayed," Alex said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I don't know if I can ever forget that you didn't. But I think I want to try. I think I want to try to see if we can build something, if we can have some kind of relationship, even if it's not perfect." For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was something. A step toward healing. But just as it seemed like the three of them might be able to find a way forward, Alex dropped a bombshell. "There's something I need to tell you both," Alex said, his tone suddenly serious. "I've made a decision about my future. I've been accepted into a program overseas. It's a chance of a lifetime. And I'm leaving in 2 months." The revelation hit Daniel and Linda like a bolt of lightning. Alex had kept this decision to himself, not wanting to influence the fragile dynamics between them. Now, just as they were beginning to mend their relationships, he was leaving. "I need to do this for myself," Alex continued, sensing their shock. "It doesn't mean I'm cutting you out of my life, but I need to find my own path. This isn't just about you, Dad. It's about me figuring out who I am, without the weight of all this." Linda and Daniel exchanged glances, both processing the news. This was the final twist, the unexpected turn in their story. Just when reconciliation seemed possible, Alex was choosing to take his own journey, leaving behind the unresolved questions of forgiveness and redemption. As the three of them sat in silence, the weight of Alex's decision hung in the air. The story wasn't ending, but it was taking a new direction, one that left both Daniel and Linda with a sense of uncertainty. The dinner ended with quiet goodbyes, but the real question lingered. Could they ever truly forgive one another? Could they move past the years of pain and resentment, or had too much time been lost? As Alex prepared to leave for his new life overseas, the future was uncertain for all of them. And so, the story concluded not with a neat resolution, but with a lingering question: one that echoed in the hearts of everyone involved. Can you truly forgive someone who abandoned you, even after a decade? What would you do in their shoes?